In the spring of the year 632, in a small town of mud brick and palm groves, on the edge of the Arabian desert, a man lay dying in the arms of his wife. He was not a king. He wore no crown, and he left behind no palace, no treasury, no standing army in the manner of the great empires to the north. He owned little more than the clothes he was buried in, and a few simple things of the household, and yet the words he had spoken over the previous 20 years had bound the scattered and feuding tribes of Arabia into something none of them yet had a name for. When word of his death moved through the narrow streets of Medina, grown men wept and refused to believe it. Some drew their swords and swore that he had not truly died. For a few trembling hours, the whole fragile thing seemed ready to come apart in their hands. It did not come apart. Instead, within a single lifetime, the followers of that man in Medina would ride out of their desert and overturn the settled order of the ancient world. They would break the armies of the Roman Emperor in Syria and drive them from lands they had held for 700 years. They would topple the empire of Persia entirely, an empire that had stood in one form or another for more than 1,000 years, and they would do it in the space of a few short campaigns. Cities that had never heard their language, Damascus and Jerusalem and Alexandria, and the great Persian capital on the Tigris, would open their gates to them. Within 30 years, a single state would stretch from the mountains of Persia to the sands of Libya, governed from a town that, a lifetime earlier, had been only a cluster of wells and date palms. This is the story of that beginning. It is the story of 4 men who ruled after the Prophet Muhammad, 4 companions who had known him in life, who are remembered by later generations as the rightly guided. It is a story of astonishing conquest and of quiet administration, of deep loyalty and of bitter division, of a brotherhood that conquered half the known world and then, in its final years, turned its swords upon itself. It begins in the stillness of a desert town, with a community suddenly left without its guide, asking the question that every new thing must one day answer: who leads now? This is the story of the Rashidun Caliphate, the birth of an empire. So find a comfortable place to rest and let the room grow dim around you. If you feel like it, you might leave a comment saying where in the world you are listening from and what hour it is where you lie. There is no need to hold on to every name or every date. Simply let the long road of this story carry you gently down towards sleep. To understand how such a thing could happen, we have to begin before it happened at all. We have to stand in Arabia in the years before the year 632 and look at a land that the wider world had long thought of as empty and poor, a place to be crossed rather than conquered. Arabia was vast, a great sun-struck expanse of gravel plains and red dunes and bare black mountains, larger than most people who spoke of it ever imagined. Along its coasts, and in a few blessed valleys, there was water and green and settled life. But across most of its interior, there was only the desert and the men who had learned to live within it. These were the Bedouin, the nomads of the sand, who moved with their camels and their goats and their tents from well to well and from pasture to pasture, following the thin rains across a country that could kill the unwary in a single afternoon. Life in that world was organised not by kings or written laws, but by blood. A man belonged first to his family, then to his clan, then to his tribe, and beyond that circle he could expect little mercy and no protection. The tribe was everything. It fed you, defended you, avenged you if you were wronged, and shamed you if you failed it. To be cast out from your tribe was very nearly a sentence of death. For a man alone in the desert was a man any stronger group could rob or kill without fear of consequence. loyalty ran fierce and narrow. Honour was guarded jealously, and an insult could echo down the years as a blood feud, a cycle of raid and revenge, and counter-revenge that might smoulder between two tribes for generations, long after anyone could remember quite how it had begun. Yet these people were not the simple savages that outsiders imagined. Their poetry was among the finest the world has known, memorized and recited around the night fires, a poetry of love and loss and pride and the harsh beauty of the desert. Their memories were extraordinary. Trained to hold whole genealogies and long odes word for word across the generations, for a people without much writing must carry their history in their heads. They knew the stars as a sailor knows the sea, and they read the wind and the sand and the behaviour of animals with a skill that seemed almost supernatural to those who had never learned it. They prized generosity above almost every other virtue, so that a poor man might slaughter his last animal to feed a stranger who came to his tent, because to be known as open-handed was worth more than the meat itself. Along the western edge of Arabia, in the region called the Hijaz, ran a line of towns that lived by trade rather than by herding. The greatest of these was Mecca, a dry and stony valley, with no river and little farmland, which had grown wealthy in a way that had nothing to do with the soil. Mecca sat astride the caravan routes that carried goods up from the ports of the south, from the spice lands of Yemen, and beyond them from India and Africa, north toward the markets of Syria and the Mediterranean world. Its merchants grew rich handling this trade. And the tribe that dominated the town, the Quraysh, became one of the most powerful and respected in all Arabia. But Mecca was more than a market. At its heart stood an ancient cube of stone called the Kaaba, a shrine so old that no one truly knew its origin, and around it had gathered the idols and gods of countless tribes. Each year, at a fixed season, the fighting was set aside, and pilgrims came from across the peninsula to worship at the shrine, to trade, to recite poetry, and to renew the fragile threads that held a fractured people loosely together. Beyond the deserts of Arabia lay a very different world, older and grander, and utterly sure of its own permanence. To the north and west sat the Roman Empire, ruled now from the city of Constantinople and known to us as the Byzantine Empire, Christian and Greek-speaking, heir to the glory of ancient Rome. Its provinces of Syria and Egypt were among the richest lands on earth, filled with great cities and cathedrals and grain fields that fed the empire. To the northeast lay its ancient rival, the Empire of Persia, ruled by the Sasanian kings from their capital at Ctesiphon on the Tigris, a realm of fire temples and palaces and proud noble houses that could trace their lineage back through the centuries. These two giants had been locked in a struggle for as long as anyone could remember, and in the years just before our story begins, they had fought the most terrible war of all, a war that dragged on for more than 20 years, and left both empires exhausted, drained of men and money, their frontier provinces ravaged, and their treasuries bled white. To the settled peoples of these lands, the tribes of the deep desert and Afat were an afterthought, useful sometimes as hired soldiers or border guards, but never a danger worth losing sleep over. They could not have imagined how wrong they were. Into this world, in the town of Mecca, around the year 570, a boy was born to the Quraysh, whose name was Muhammad, orphaned young, raised first by his grandfather and then by an uncle. He grew into a man known among his neighbours as trustworthy and thoughtful, a merchant who travelled the caravan roads and who kept the habit of going alone into the hills to think and to pray. He was a man of the world he had been born into, and yet in his 40s he began to speak of visions and revelations that would remake that world entirely. He spoke of one God, single and supreme, before whom all the idols of the Kaaba were nothing, and he called the proud and the humble alike to submit to that, and to submit to that God, and to treat one another with a justice and a mercy that cut against the harsh old code of blood and tribe. Some believed him at once. Many more did not, and the leaders of Mecca, whose wealth and standing were bound up with the old shrine and the old ways, came to see him as a danger. What followed, and what he built in the years of struggle that came after, would set the stage for everything this story has yet to tell. The message that Muhammad brought was, in its own way, a quiet revolution against the very foundations of the society into which it fell. It taught that the poor and the powerful stood equal before God, that a former slave might be closer to heaven than a wealthy chief, and that the old bonds of tribe and blood were to be subordinate to a new and wider bond, the bond of shared faith. To the rulers of Mecca this was intolerable, for it threatened both their gods and their standing. The small community of believers around Muhammad was mocked, then pressured, then persecuted outright. Some of the weakest among them, slaves and the poor, with no tribe to shield them, were beaten and tortured. For a decade, the little community endured in the shadow of the Quraysh, growing slowly, protected only by the personal standing of Muhammad within his own clan, and by the loyalty of a handful of powerful early followers. But protection could not last forever, and by the year 622, the situation in Mecca had grown so dangerous that a great decision was made, one that would become the true beginning of the community as a people rather than a persecuted sect. Some 250 miles to the north lay another town, an oasis of farms and date groves, then called Yathrib, and later known as Medina, the city of the Prophet. Its people were divided by their own long and weary feuds, and a number of them, hearing of Muhammad and his message, invited him to come and settle among them, to be their guide, and to bring peace to their quarrels. Quietly, in small groups, the believers slipped out of Mecca and made the journey north, until at last Muhammad himself, warned that his enemies meant to kill him, left the city under cover of darkness and made his way to Medina. This migration, called the Hijra, was so momentous that later generations would begin the counting of their years from it, so that the Islamic calendar dates not from the birth of the faith or from any battle, but from this quiet flight of a hunted community toward a place where it could at last live openly. In Medina, the community became something new. It was no longer merely a group of believers within a hostile city. It was a society of its own, with Muhammad as its leader in prayer, and in law, and in war. And around him the outlines of a state began, almost without anyone planning it, to take shape. The years in Medina were years of struggle and of steady growth. The men of Mecca did not forget the community that had escaped them, and 3 times their armies marched north to crush it, at a place called Badra. A small and outnumbered force of believers won an astonishing victory that seemed to many a sign of divine favour. At Uhud the following year, they were beaten badly, and Muhammad himself was wounded, a reminder that faith did not guarantee an easy road. Then came the greatest trial of all, when a vast coalition of Meccans and their allies besieged Medina itself, and the defenders dug a trench across the exposed approaches to the town, and held out until the great host, cold and hungry, and quarrelling among itself, broke apart and drifted home. Through all of this, the community grew, drawing in tribes and clans across the region, until the balance of power in the Hijaz had shifted beyond recovery. In the year 630, with an army so large that resistance was hopeless, Muhammad returned to Mecca the city that had cast him out, and took it almost without bloodshed. He entered the shrine at the heart of the town, cleared away the idols that had stood there, and rededicated the ancient Kaaba to the one God. The city that had been his enemy became the holiest place of his faith. With Mecca won, the tribes of Arabia began to send their envoys to Medina in a steady stream, some out of true belief, some out of the plain calculation that this rising power was one to join rather than to fight. In the space of a few short years, a peninsula that had never in its history been united under a single authority was drawn, tribe by tribe, into a single community bound by faith and by allegiance to the man in Medina. It was an achievement without precedent, and it rested to an extraordinary degree upon the person of Muhammad himself. He was the prophet whose words were the law, the judge who settled disputes, the leader who commanded in war, and the centre around which the whole new thing turned. And this was precisely the danger that no one liked to speak of aloud. For a state built so entirely around one man is a state that trembles at the thought of losing him. When he was gone, what would hold it together? Who could possibly stand in his place? That question, so long avoided, arrived without warning in the year 632. Muhammad had led a great pilgrimage to Mecca, and spoken to these assembled thousands in words that many felt carried the weight of a farewell. Not long after his return to Medina, he fell ill with a fever that would not break. For days he weakened until at last, resting in the chamber of his wife Aisha, he died. He was perhaps 60 years old. The grief that swept through Medina was immense, and it was dangerous, for it struck at the very foundation of everything the community had become. Some among the believers were so shattered that they could not accept the news. One of the closest and fiercest of the companions, a powerful man named Umar, stood before the mourners and declared that the Prophet had not died, but had only gone to God for a time, and would return, and he threatened any who said otherwise. The community stood at the edge of chaos, leaderless and stunned, its whole future hanging in the balance of a single grief-stricken hour. It was another of the closest companions who steadied them. His name was Abu Bakr, a gentle and soft-spoken merchant among the very first to believe in Muhammad and the dearest of his friends. Abu Bakr came into the chamber, looked upon the face of the man he had followed for more than 20 years, and then went out to the frightened crowd. He confirmed the death, plainly and without flinching, a host of golden daffodils, and he spoke words that the tradition has remembered ever since, telling the people that whoever had worshipped Muhammad should know that Muhammad was dead, but whoever worshipped God should know that God was living and would never die. The message cut through the panic. The faith did not rest upon the life of one man, however beloved. It rested upon something the death of no man could touch. Umar, hearing it, sank to the ground, his legs failing beneath him, and the community, weeping still but no longer unmoored, turned at last to face the question it could no longer avoid. The Prophet was gone. Someone had to lead. There was no plan for this. Muhammad had named no clear successor, had left no written instruction settling the matter, and the community had no tradition and no machinery for choosing a ruler because it had never before needed one. In the hours after his death, while his body still lay unburied, the danger of a fracture was very real. The Muslims of Medina, the people who had welcomed the community and given it a home, gathered by themselves in a covered hall to consider making a leader from among their own number. Word of this reached the companions who had come from Mecca, and Abu Bakr and Umar and a few others hurried to the gathering, for if the two great groups within the community chose separate leaders, in that moment the whole fragile unity might split along the oldest fault line of all. In that crowded hall, with tempers rising and old tribal instincts stirring beneath the surface, the future of the community was decided in a single tense debate. Abu Bakr spoke to them with a calm that cooled the room. He acknowledged the great service of the men of Medina, praised them sincerely, and then argued that the wider community of Arabs would only accept leadership from the tribe of the Prophet himself, the Quraysh of Mecca, whose standing across the peninsula was unmatched. It was a hard truth, but it was a true one, and it turned the discussion. Then Umar, that same fierce man whose grief had nearly broken him, seized the moment. He reached out, took the hand of Abu Bakr, and publicly pledged his loyalty to him as the successor, the leader of the community. Others pressed forward to do the same, and the gathering that might have ended in division ended instead in a choice. Abu Bakr, the quiet merchant, the oldest friend, became the first caliph, a word that means simply the successor or the deputy, the one who stands in the place left empty. He would not be a prophet, for the age of prophecy was closed. He would be a leader of men and of the community they had built, the first of the four who are remembered as the rightly guided. Almost at once, the new caliph found that his authority was a rope stretched to breaking. Across Arabia, as the news of Muhammad's death spread, whole tribes decided that their allegiance had been to the man and not to the community he left behind. And now that he was gone, they considered themselves free. Some simply refused to send the alms and taxes that bound them to Medina, treating the obligation as a personal debt that death had cancelled. Others went further and threw off the faith altogether, returning to their old gods and their old independence. In several regions, ambitious men rose up claiming to be prophets themselves, gathering large followings and setting up rival powers that threatened to tear the whole peninsula back into the fragments from which Muhammad had briefly forged it. Within weeks of taking office, Abu Bakr faced the collapse of everything. The unity of Arabia, that unprecedented and fragile achievement, seemed about to dissolve in his hands. Many of the older companions counselled caution. The community was small, its position uncertain, and it seemed madness to make war on half of Arabia at once when a softer hand might hold the loyal core together and let the rest drift away in peace. But Abu Bakr, for all his gentleness, proved immovable on this one point. He would not surrender the smallest part of what had been built. He declared that he would fight any who tried to separate what Muhammad had joined, that he would not release a single obligation the tribes owed, and that if they withheld even a rope that they had once given, he would make war upon them for it. It was a decision of iron from a man known for his softness, and it set the course of everything that followed. The wars that came are remembered as the Ridda Wars, the wars of apostasy, and in the space of little more than a year they would either destroy the young community or forge it into something far harder than it had been. The rebellion was not one thing, but many, a whole peninsula coming loose at once, and its dangers wore several different faces. In some places the trouble was simple refusal, tribes that had accepted the leadership of Muhammad, and now declined to accept anyone else, willing to keep the faith in some fashion, but unwilling to send their arms to Medina or to obey a new master. In other places, the break was total, a return to the old gods and the old freedom. But the sharpest danger of all came from a handful of ambitious men and women who saw in the death of the Prophet an opening for themselves, and who rose up claiming that they too received revelations, that they too were prophets, gathering large followings and setting up rival powers across the land. In the region of Central Arabia, a man named Tulayha proclaimed himself a prophet, and drew many tribes to his banner. In the far northeast, a woman named Sajah, a Christian of noble birth and great force of character, rose at the head of her own people and marched with the same claim, and in the fertile eastern district of Yamama. The most dangerous of them all held sway. A man remembered by his enemies as Musaylima, who commanded a large and disciplined following, and whose challenge to Medina was the gravest of the whole rebellion. Faced with so many fires burning at once, Abu Bakr did something that revealed the steel beneath his gentleness. He refused to be overwhelmed by the scale of it. Rather than huddle in Medina and try to hold only the core, he divided the loyal fighting men into several columns and sent them out in different directions, each with its own commander and its own target, striking at the risings one after another, before they could gather into a single, unstoppable flood. It was a bold and even reckless strategy, spreading thin forces across a vast and hostile country, and it depended utterly on speed and on the quality of his commanders. But it worked. Tulayha was beaten in the field, and his following melted away. And he himself, in time, returned to the faith and lived to fight in the great conquests to come, an ending that says something about the fluid and personal nature of these desert loyalties. Sajah, finding her cause faltering, made an alliance with Musaylima in the east, and then withdrew from the struggle altogether, her rebellion spent. Musaylima, however, would not be talked down or frightened off, and it was against him that the hardest fighting of the whole war was done. In the district of Yamama, his forces met the armies of Medina in a battle of terrible ferocity, a struggle so bloody that the place where the fiercest of it was fought became known ever after as the Garden of Death. The rebels fought with desperate courage, and for a time the outcome hung in the balance. But at last the men of Medina broke them, and Musaylima himself was killed in the press. The victory ended the most serious threat to the community, but it came at a fearful price, for among the many who fell that day were a great number of those who had memorized the revelations of the Quran by heart, the living carriers of the sacred text. Their deaths, more than any other single event, planted the fear that would one day move a later caliph to gather the scattered revelations into a single fixed and written book, so that the loss of memories in a morning of battle could never again endanger the words themselves. So, even in this early and half-forgotten war, the future was quietly taking shape. To fight them, Abu Bakr turned to a soldier whose name would become a terror across two empires. He was Khalid ibn al-Walid, a Meccan of the Quraysh who had once fought fiercely against Muhammad, who had commanded the cavalry that broke the believers at Uhud, and who had come over to the faith only after Mecca fell. Whatever the past, his gift for war was beyond question. A cold and brilliant instinct for the movement of armies, and the moment of the strike that seemed never to fail him. He would come to be called the Sword of God. Abu Bakr sent him against the most dangerous of the rebel powers, marching his columns across the desert with a speed that gave his enemies no time to gather, striking one, rising after another, before they could combine into a single overwhelming force. The fighting was hard and often bloody. In the fiercest battle of all, against the followers of a rival prophet in the region of Yamama, the losses among the believers were so heavy that a great number of those who had memorized the revelations of the Quran were killed in a single day, a loss that would soon have consequences no one yet foresaw. Within a year, against all expectation, the wars were won. Tribe by tribe, region by region, Arabia was brought back under the authority of Medina, and this time the bond held. Something had changed in the fighting of those hard months. The community had discovered that it could raise armies, move them across vast distances, and impose its will by force upon a whole peninsula. It had generals who could win, soldiers hardened by real war, and a caliph who had shown that he would not bend. The energies that had so nearly torn Arabia apart in rebellion were now gathered and pointed outward, and beyond the northern deserts lay the exhausted and unsuspecting empires of Rome and Persia, their frontier lands rich and poorly defended after their long, ruinous war. Almost without a grand decision being made, the armies that had reconquered Arabia kept marching, north and east, across the old frontiers, into the settled world. The age of conquest had begun. The first probing raids into the Persian borderlands of Iraq were led once again by Khalid, and their success was startling. The Sasanian Empire, the ancient and glittering power, was in the grip of a deep crisis, its throne fought over by a rapid succession of claimants, its noble houses divided, its strength hollowed out by the recent war with Rome. Its frontier garrisons, expecting nothing more than the usual desert raiders, found themselves facing disciplined armies that struck hard, moved fast, and did not go home. Town after town along the lower Euphrates fell or came to terms. Then, at the height of these early victories in Iraq, Abu Bakr made a decision that showed both his boldness and his ruthlessness. He ordered Khalid to leave the Persian front and march west to reinforce the armies that were beginning to press against Roman Syria. The march that followed became legendary, a crossing of waterless desert that lesser men would have called impossible. Camels slaughtered to provide water stored in their bellies, the column pushing on through the burning waste until it burst upon the Roman flank from a direction no one had thought an army could come. The sword of God had appeared where he could not be, and the war for Syria was transformed. But Abu Bakr would not live to see how that war ended. His caliphate lasted only about 2 years, a span so short and yet so decisive that it is hard to overstate its importance. In those 2 years he had held the community together through the death of its founder, crushed the great rebellion that nearly destroyed it, and launched the conquests that would carry it across the world. Now, worn out and ailing, he felt his own end approaching, and he turned his mind to the very problem that had so nearly wrecked the community. When Muhammad died, he would not leave the succession to chance, and to the dangerous scramble of a leaderless hour. In his final illness, he consulted the leading companions, weighed the matter carefully, and named the man he judged fittest to lead, setting down his choice so that there could be no doubt. The man he chose was Umar, that same fierce and towering figure whose grief had almost broken the community and whose hand had first pledged loyalty to Abu Bakr in the covered hall. In the year 634, the gentle merchant died, and the community, this time without panic and without division, turned to its second caliph. Umar ibn al-Khattab was a very different man from the friend he succeeded. Where Abu Bakr had been soft-spoken and mild, Umar was hard, stern, and famously severe, a giant of a man with a presence that made even bold men careful of their words in his presence. Before his conversion, he had been among the most dangerous enemies of the faith, and something of that old ferocity never left him. But it was now bent entirely to the service of justice, as he understood it. He was scrupulous to the point of harshness in his own life, living simply, wearing patched clothing, sleeping on the bare ground, refusing every luxury even as the wealth of conquered empires began to flow toward Medina. He walked the streets of the city at night to see for himself how his people fared, and it was said that he feared he would be answerable before God for a single beast that stumbled on a broken road anywhere in his vast domain. because he had not seen the road repaired. Under this austere and formidable man, the community would win its greatest victories and take the shape of a true empire, and the 10 years of his rule would prove among the most consequential of any decade in the history of the world. 1. For the conquest, which had begun almost by accident under Abu Bakr, now became a sustained and deliberate enterprise. Pag, driven forward year after year with a momentum that seemed impossible to stop. The armies of Arabia poured into Syria and into Iraq in a rising flood, and the two great empires that had ruled those lands for centuries, already exhausted, found that they had no answer to this new and unfamiliar kind of war. The Arab armies were fast, mobile, and bound together by a fierce common purpose, able to vanish into the desert that no imperial army could follow, and to reappear where they were least expected. They were led by commanders of rare ability, and they fought with the conviction of men who believed that victory was a sign of divine favour, and that death in the struggle was itself a kind of victory. Against such an enemy, the slow and heavy machinery of the old empires, their mercenary garrisons and their divided commands, began to break down. The decisive tests were coming, the great battles that would decide the fate of Syria and of Persia, and it is to those battles that our story now turns. The struggle for Syria came to its climax in the summer of 636, on a hot and dusty plain in the valley of a river called the Yarmouk, a tributary that runs down toward the Jordan through a country of steep ravines and broken ground. The Roman Emperor Heraclius, who had only a few years earlier won a great and hard-fought triumph over Persia, understood the danger at last and gathered a huge army to drive the invaders out of his eastern provinces once and for all. It was a force far larger than anything the Arabs could muster, drawn from across the empire and its allies, well equipped and confident of victory against what it still regarded as a rabble of desert raiders. Against this host stood the Arab armies, badly outnumbered but commanded once again by Khalid ibn al-Walid, who had taken effective control of the field. Knowing he could not match the Romans in numbers, he chose the ground with care, using the ravines and the desert at his back to protect his flanks and to give his mobile horsemen room to strike. The battle was not the affair of a single day, but a grinding struggle that stretched across the better part of a week, fought under a punishing sun, and, on the final day, in a blinding storm of wind and dust that blew straight into the faces of the Roman lines. Day after day the great imperial army pressed forward, and day after day it was held, its attacks blunted, its confidence slowly bleeding away. Khalid husbanded his cavalry with a cold patience, refusing to spend it too soon, waiting for the moment when the enemy had committed itself and grown weary. When that moment came, on the last day, with the dust storm masking his movements, he swung his mounted reserve around the Roman flank and cut them off from the bridge and the road that were their only line of retreat. What had been a battle became a catastrophe. The huge Roman army, trapped against the ravines with no way out, broke apart and was destroyed, great numbers of its men driven over the cliffs or cut down as they tried to flee. It was one of the most decisive battles in all of history. With that single week of fighting, Roman power in Syria was shattered beyond any hope of recovery. When the news reached Heraclius, the aging emperor understood that the game was lost. Tradition remembers him gazing back at the hills of Syria as he departed for the north and bidding the province a bitter farewell, a last goodbye to a rich and ancient land that Rome had held for 7 centuries and would never hold again. One by one, the great cities came under Arab rule. Damascus, that beautiful and ancient city of gardens and running water, opened its gates. Antioch, one of the greatest cities of the Christian world, followed. The whole of Syria and the lands around it passed, within a few short years, from Roman hands into the hands of the Caliph in Medina, and here something must be said about the manner of the conquest, because it explains much about why it endured. The conquerors did not, as a rule, force the peoples they conquered to change their faith. Christians and Jews were permitted to keep their religion and their places of worship in return for a tax and return oneness and their submission to the new order. For many of the ordinary people of Syria, ground down by heavy Roman taxation and torn by bitter religious quarrels within the Christian world, the change of masters was not the disaster it might have been. And in some places the new rulers were met with something closer to relief than to resistance. While Syria was being won, the war against Persia in the east was reaching its own decisive hour. The Sasanian Empire, unlike the Romans, had no distant heartland to retreat to. Iraq was the very centre of its power, the rich alluvial land between the two rivers, where its capital stood and its wealth was gathered. And to lose Iraq was to lose the empire itself. For a time the Persians had been too weak and too divided to mount a serious defence, but now a strong figure emerged at last to rally them, and they gathered a great army to throw the invaders back across the desert. The two forces met in the year 636, in the same fateful season as Yarmouk, on the plain of Qadisiyah, near the edge of the settled land, where the desert of Arabia gives way to the green of Iraq. The Persian army was formidable, and it brought with it a weapon the Arabs had never faced in strength. War elephants, towering beasts armoured and carrying fighting men that terrified the Arab horses and trampled paths of ruin through their ranks. Like Yarmouk, the Battle of Qadisiyah was a struggle of several days, remembered in tradition by the names given to each day of the fighting, days of hard fortune and terrible loss. The Arab commander was a companion named Saad, and the fighting swayed back and forth with a violence that at times seemed likely to end in the destruction of the whole Arab force. The elephants were the greatest danger, and the Arabs learned to fight them only through bitter experience cutting at their trunks and their eyes, aiming for the men who rode them until the great beasts, maddened and wounded, turned and fled back through the Persian lines, spreading as much havoc among their own side as they had among the enemy. On the final night, called the Night of Clamour, the fighting did not stop with the darkness, but raged on through the black hours. And when the sun rose, the Persian army was broken. Its great commander was killed, its sacred battle standard captured, and the road to the heart of the empire lay open. As at Yarmouk, a single great battle had decided the fate of a realm. With their army destroyed at Qadisiyah, the Persians could no longer hold their capital. The Arab forces marched on Ctesiphon, the vast imperial city on the Tigris, seat of the kings of kings, a place of such wealth and splendour that the simple men of the desert could scarcely believe their eyes when they entered it. They walked through palaces hung with carpets woven from silk and gold thread, through halls whose ceilings soared above them, and they gathered up a treasure so immense that the accounts of it strain belief. Mountains of gold and silver and jewels, the accumulated riches of 1,000 years of empire. There is a tradition telling of the simplicity and the honesty that Umar demanded of his men, that the plunder was gathered faithfully and sent back to Medina, and that when the great heaps of treasure were laid before the austere Caliph, he wept, not for joy but from foreboding, saying that a people given such riches would surely fall to envying and fighting one another over them. It was a prophecy that the later years of this very story would prove terribly true, The fall of Ctesiphon was not the end of the war with Persia, for the empire, though mortally wounded, did not die at once. Its last king, a young man named Yazdegerd, fled eastward and spent years trying to rally the distant provinces. And there were more battles yet to come, above all a great and bloody clash at a place called Nahavand, a few years later remembered as the Victory of Victories, which finally broke the last organised Persian resistance. After that, the ancient empire simply dissolved, province by province, its lands passed under Arab rule, until the whole vast realm, from Iraq across the Iranian plateau toward the borders of Central Asia, belonged to the Caliphate. The fugitive king wandered ever farther east, his followers falling away, until at last, so the story goes, he was murdered by a common miller for the sake of his fine clothes, a lonely and squalid end for the last of a line of kings that stretched back through the centuries. The empire of Persia, that immovable pillar of the ancient world, was gone. The fall of Persia deserves a moment of its own, for it was a thing without real precedent in the memory of the ancient world. The Roman Empire had lost provinces before, had been pushed back, and had recovered, and even now, beaten in Syria and Egypt, it survived, drawing back into its heartland around Constantinople, to endure for centuries more. But Persia did not merely lose provinces. Persia ended the empire of the Sasanian kings, and behind it, the older empires of the Persians, stretching back through the ages, an unbroken tradition of imperial power. More than 1,000 years deep, was extinguished entirely, its kings gone, its capital taken, its noble houses scattered or absorbed, its ancient faith of the sacred fire slowly ebbing away as the generations passed, for the men of Arabia to have toppled. Such a thing, a civilization that had seemed as permanent as the mountains, was an event that shook the imagination of all who witnessed it, and it took time for the world even to grasp that it had truly happened. The extinguishing was not the work of a single battle, but of years of hard campaigning across an enormous and difficult land. After Qadisiyah and the fall of the capital, the Persians rallied again and again in the highlands and the distant provinces, and again they were beaten, most decisively at Nahavand. A few years later, the battle the Arabs called the Victory of Victories, because it broke the last great army the empire could field. After that, the resistance became a matter of scattered nobles and fortified towns and mountain strongholds, each of which had to be reduced in its turn, so that the conquest of the Iranian lands went on, region by region, for years, a slow and grinding advance into a country of high plateaus and fierce winters and proud peoples who did not easily submit. The last king, Yazdegerd, a young man who had inherited a throne already crumbling beneath him, fled ever eastward ahead of the advance, calling upon his distant governors for armies that never came, his following thinning at every stage, until he was little more than a fugitive with a handful of companions. His death, when it came at last, in a miller's hut far to the east, murdered for the fine clothes on his back by a man who did not know or care who he was a small and squalid ending to a line of kings that had ruled in splendour for centuries, and it seemed to later ages a kind of parable of how completely the old order had passed. What rose in its place, over the generations that followed, was something new and unexpected, for the Persians, though conquered, were far from erased. Their ancient learning, their skill in administration and craft and art, their deep traditions of statecraft and courtly refinement, flowed into the new civilization, and enriched it beyond measure, so that in time the conquered gave nearly as much to the conquerors as they received. Many of the greatest scholars and officials and thinkers of the Muslim world in the centuries to come would be of Persian blood, carrying the old genius of their people into a new age and a new faith. The conquest, which had begun as an armed collision between the desert and the empire, became, in the long run, a marriage of civilizations. And the child of that marriage was one of the most brilliant cultures the world has known. But all of that lay far in the future, dimly unimaginable to the tired soldiers who stood among the wonders of fallen Ctesiphon and could scarcely believe the ancient empire was truly theirs. Amid these thunderous victories in the field, one moment stands apart, quiet and full of meaning, and it took place at the city of Jerusalem. The holy city, sacred to Jews and Christians alike, had held out for a time behind its walls while the country around it fell. But at last, with no relief coming and no hope of rescue, its people agreed to surrender. Yet the Christian patriarch who led the city made one condition. He would give up Jerusalem only to the Caliph himself, coming in person to receive it, and so the austere and mighty ruler of an empire that now stretched across 3 of the richest regions of the world set out from Medina and made the long journey north to take possession of the holy city. The manner of his coming became famous. He travelled with a single servant and a single camel, and the 2 of them took turns riding, so that each walked half the way while the other rode. When they came at last within sight of Jerusalem, it happened to be the servant's turn to ride, and the caliph's turn to walk, and the ruler of half the known world entered the holy city on foot, leading the camel, dressed in travel-worn and patched clothing, while his servant sat mounted above him. The Christians of the city, who had expected a conqueror in gold and purple, found instead this plain and dusty figure, and the contrast made a deep impression that echoed down the centuries. Umar treated the city and its people with a restraint that surprised them. He guaranteed the safety of the inhabitants and their churches, and there is a well-loved tradition that when the hour of prayer came while he was being shown through the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site in the Christian world, he declined to pray inside it. He stepped outside to make his prayer instead, explaining that if he prayed within the church, his followers in later times might seize upon the act as a pretext to take the building for themselves and turn it into a place of their own worship. By praying outside, he preserved the church for the Christians. It was a small gesture, but it captured something essential about the man and about the ideal. However imperfectly the ideal was always kept, of a rule that could be both utterly confident and strangely careful of those it had conquered. To the west of Syria lay the greatest prize of all, the province of Egypt, the ancient granary of the Roman world, its river valley so fertile that it had fed great cities and empires since before the memory of any nation. The conquest of Egypt was largely the work of one remarkable man, a companion named Amr ibn al-Az, a shrewd and capable soldier and administrator who had known the country from his trading days, and who pressed the Caliph for permission to invade. With a force that was at first almost recklessly small, he crossed the frontier and struck into the Nile Delta, and once again, the machinery of Roman rule, demoralized and divided, proved unable to stop him. The great fortress of Babylon near the head of the delta fell after a long siege, and then Amr turned toward the crown jewel of the province, the fabled city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, second only to Constantinople itself, among the cities of the empire, a place of libraries and lighthouses and marble colonnades, defended by strong walls and open to supply and reinforcement from the sea. Alexandria might have held out for a very long time, and for a while it did, but the will to resist was crumbling faster than the walls. The Roman government was in disarray, its leaders quarrelling among themselves, and at last a truce was arranged, and the great city was handed over. Hammer wrote to Umar a description of his prize that has been remembered, telling of a city of countless palaces and baths and columns and theatres, a place of wonders beyond counting. Rather than try to govern this ancient and unruly Greek city from within, Amrah founded a new settlement of his own on the mainland, a camp town near the old fortress of Babylon that would grow into a great city in its own right, and that stands today at the heart of Cairo. Egypt, with its endless grain and its teeming wealth, was now part of the Caliphate, and the treasure of its harvests, which had once fed Constantinople, was turned instead toward Arabia. In the space of a single decade, under the stern hand of Umar, the community that had begun as a persecuted band in Mecca had become the master of Syria, of Iraq, of Persia, and of Egypt, an empire that dwarfed anything its founders could have dreamed. Winning such an empire was one thing, governing it was another. And it is here that the greatness of Umar shows most clearly, for he proved to be not only a stern war leader, but one of the most gifted administrators of the ancient world. The community that had ridden out of the desert now found itself ruling millions of people, of many faiths and languages, cultivating rich provinces, collecting vast revenues, and keeping large armies in the field far from home. None of this had existed a generation earlier, and there was no ready-made system to manage it. Umar built one, largely from nothing, with a practical genius that borrowed freely from the older empires it had replaced, while bending everything to the needs and the ideals of the new order. He organized the conquered lands into provinces under appointed governors, and he watched those governors with a ferocious and suspicious eye, ready to summon any of them back to answer for the smallest sign of corruption or arrogance. For he trusted no man with power for long without accounting. One of his most important and far-reaching decisions concerned the soldiers and the land. Umar refused to let the conquering armies simply seize the farms and estates of the conquered, and settle down as a new landlord class, scattered and softened among the peoples they ruled. He understood that this would both destroy the productive wealth of the provinces and dissolve the fighting strength and the unity of the community. Instead, the conquered lands were largely left in the hands of those who worked them, who continued to farm and to pay their taxes, and the soldiers were kept apart in great garrison cities planted at key points across the empire. Kufa and Basra rose in Iraq, Fustat in Egypt, and others elsewhere, new cities that began as sprawling armed camps and grew into centres of population and culture and, in time, into hotbeds of politics and discontent. The soldiers were paid from a register, a great roll of names called the Diwan, which recorded who was entitled to a share of the state revenues, and how much, ranked according to their service and their closeness to the earliest days of the faith. It was a system that fed and rewarded the army without letting it dissolve into the land, and it worked, for a time, brilliantly. Umar also gave the new civilization its measure of time. It was under his rule that the counting of the years was fixed, and rather than begin the calendar from the birth of the Prophet, or from any of the great victories, it was decided to begin it from the Hijra, that quiet migration from Mecca to Medina that had marked the birth of the community as a society. So the years were numbered from that flight, and they are numbered from it still across a great part of the world, more than 14 centuries later, in matters of law and of justice, in the collection and distribution of the treasury, in the building of roads and the digging of canals, in the care, at least in principle, for the poor and the traveller and the orphan. Umar laid foundations that would shape the empire long after he was gone. He held the whole vast structure together by the sheer force of his character, his justice, and his fear of God, and while he lived it held. But the very success of the conquests was gathering wealth and power and ambition in dangerous quantities, and the man who might have mastered those forces was about to be taken away. Before we come to the end of this remarkable man, it is worth dwelling a little on the stories that gathered around his justice, for they are the truest window into why the age he shaped was remembered as gold. It was said of Umar that he lived in a plainness that shamed the wealth flowing all around him, that he owned a single worn cloak patched in many places, and that when an envoy from the defeated Persian court came seeking the great ruler of the Arabs, he found him not upon a throne in a hall of gold, but asleep upon the bare ground in the shade of a wall, with no guard and no ceremony, an old man in simple clothes who governed half the world and slept like the poorest of his subjects. The envoy is said to have marvelled at it, understanding that a people whose ruler lived so could not easily be conquered, for there was nothing soft in them to break. There is a famous year in his reign, remembered as the Year of Ashes, when a terrible drought and famine struck Arabia, and the land turned grey and barren, and the people went hungry. Umar, it is told, refused to eat any rich food while his people starved, taking only bread and oil, until his own body grew thin and his colour changed, saying that he would be the last to fill his belly, while a single one of those in his care went without. He organised relief from the wealthier provinces, bringing grain by camel train from Egypt to feed the starving, and elsewhere to feed the starving, and he laboured day and night at the work until the rains came again. Whether every detail of such stories is history or the loving embroidery of later memory hardly matters, for the fact that they were told, and told about him rather than about others, shows what the age believed a ruler ought to be, and against what standard it measured him and found him worthy. He was fierce, too, in guarding the rights of the humble against the great, even against his own governors and their sons. There is a tale, cherished for centuries, of a Christian man of Egypt who came all the way to Medina to complain that the son of the powerful governor of that province, the conqueror Amr himself, had struck him unjustly in a fit of arrogance. Umar summoned the mighty governor and his son to the capital, and before the assembled people he gave the wronged man leave to strike the governor's son in return, so that the proud should feel what the humble had felt, and he is said to have rebuked the great governor with words that rang down the ages, asking by what right he had enslaved men when their mothers had borne them free. True or not, in every particular, the story captures the ideal at the heart of the Rashidun age, the ideal that no man, however powerful, stood above justice, and that the plainest subject might bring the mightiest governor to account before the caliph. It was an ideal that the later empires of kings would honour, mostly in the breach, which is exactly why the age that seemed to honour it in truth kept its golden light in memory long after its cities had turned to dust. The end came, as such ends often do, from an unexpected quarter, and with a terrible suddenness. Among the many people brought to Medina in the wake of the conquests was a Persian slave and craftsman, a skilled worker in metal and carpentry, who bore a bitter and private grievance, whether against the tax he was required to pay to his master, or against the ruin of his homeland, or some tangle of both. One dark morning in the year 644, as Umar led the community in the dawn prayer, standing before the ranks, as he had 1,000 times before, this man stepped from the crowd and struck him several times with a dagger. The blows were mortal, The mighty Caliph, who had bestridden the world and made emperors flee before his armies, was carried away dying, and within a few days he was gone, murdered in the very act of prayer in the heart of his own city. The manner of his death struck the community with grief and with dread, for a great pillar had fallen, and the men who now had to choose his successor knew that they were smaller than the man they had lost. Umar, dying, had thought carefully about the succession as Abu Bakr had before him, but he chose a different path. He would not simply name one man, and he would not leave the community to the dangerous, free scramble that had nearly wrecked it at the death of the Prophet. Instead, he appointed a small council of 6 of the most senior and respected companions, men of the earliest days and highest standing, and he charged them to choose one of their own number as the next caliph within 3 days, binding them to reach a decision and setting rules to prevent a deadlock. It was an attempt to combine the wisdom of a chosen few with the legitimacy of a genuine choice, and among those 6 sat the 2 men whose rivalry, gentle at first and then bitter, would shape the rest of this story. One was Uthman ibn Affan, an elderly and immensely wealthy merchant of the powerful Umayyad clan of the Quraysh, a man of great generosity and mild temperament, married to 2 of the Prophet's daughters in turn, and honoured for his early faith. The other was Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's own cousin, raised almost as a son in his household, married to his daughter Fatima, the father of his only surviving grandsons, a man of famed courage and piety and learning who had been at the very centre of the faith from its first days. The council deliberated, and the choice fell upon Uthman. He was older, milder, and less likely to impose a harsh personal rule, and to the leading men of the Quraysh his elevation was welcome, for he was one of their own great families. And so, in the year 644, Uthman became the 3rd caliph, and for a time all seemed well. The conquests continued and even expanded, pressing farther into Persia and North Africa and out across the seas. For it was under Uthman that the Arabs first built fleets and took to the water, winning naval victories against the Romans in the Mediterranean and seizing islands that had been Roman since before the memory of any living person. The treasury was full, the empire was at peace within its borders, and the mild old caliph was known for his open-handedness, his gentleness, and his deep personal devotion. In these years he performed one of the most lasting services of his entire reign, a work whose importance can hardly be measured. The revelations that Muhammad had brought had been preserved partly in the memories of those who had learned them by heart, and partly in scattered, written fragments, recorded on whatever came to hand in a society that wrote little, on pieces of parchment and leather, on flat stones and the shoulder blades of animals, on the ribs of palm branches, as the community spread across a vast empire, and as the generation that had heard the revelations from the Prophet's own lips grew old and began to die, some in the wars, a danger arose that the sacred text might come to be recited in differing ways in different regions, that variations might creep in and multiply, that the very words might one day be disputed. Uthman, hearing that the reciters of one province differed from those of another, and fearing exactly this, ordered that a single authoritative written version be prepared, gathering the fragments and the memorized text and setting them down in one fixed and careful form. Copies of this standard text were then sent out to the great cities of the empire, and the other varying versions were withdrawn. It is this text, established under the 3rd caliph, that has been recited and copied by countless hands across 14 centuries, remaining, in the belief of those who hold it sacred, unchanged to this day. whatever else is said of Uthman, and much would be said against him, this achievement endured beyond all the quarrels of his age. It was under Uthman, too, that the empire reached farther in almost every direction than it ever had before, and the sheer scale of its expansion in these years is easy to overlook amid the troubles that followed. To the west of Egypt, the armies pressed on into the lands of North Africa, across the deserts and the coastal plains that had once been the granary of Carthage, and then of Rome, raiding deep into territory that no Arab army had seen. To the east, beyond the ruin of Persia, the frontier crept ever outward toward the great rivers of Central Asia, and toward the mountain passes that led on toward the lands of India, and, dimly, toward the borders of China, until the reach of the Caliph in Medina touched places whose very names were strange in Arabia. In the far north, the armies pushed up against the peoples of the Caucasus, in a hard and unforgiving country of high mountains and fierce tribes, where the easy victories of the plains gave way to grinding and inconclusive war. The tide that had begun as a trickle out of the desert under Abu Bakr was now a flood that seemed to have no natural edge, spreading until it met deserts and mountains and seas that finally slowed. The seas, above all, marked a new departure. For the Arabs had been a people of the land, of the camel and the horse and the dry interior, with no tradition of the water, and at first a healthy fear of it. Umar had refused to let his men take to ships at all, mistrusting an element he did not understand, and would not risk his soldiers upon. But Uthman, pressed by his governors, and above all by the able and ambitious Muawiyah in Syria, gave his permission at last, and the Arabs built fleets and learned, with astonishing speed, to fight upon the water. They seized the island of Cyprus, which had been Roman since before anyone could remember, and they raided others, and then, in a great sea battle off the coast, remembered as the Battle of the Masts, they met the fleet of the Roman Emperor himself and defeated it, a stunning reversal on the very element where Rome had ruled supreme for centuries. The people of the desert had become, within a single generation, a naval power capable of challenging Constantinople in its own waters. It was one of the most improbable transformations of the whole age, and it showed how deeply the energy of these years ran, that men who had never seen the sea in their youth could master it before they were old. All of this, the conquests and the fleets and the far frontiers, meant that the empire Uthman governed was larger and richer, and more complex than the one Umar had left him, and that very growth was part of the strain that would soon break his peace. An empire of such size could not be governed as a small community had been governed, by a handful of companions who knew one another and shared the memory of the Prophet. It needed governors and garrisons and tax collectors in distant provinces, men who could not be watched closely, and who ruled far from the eye of the Caliph, and the choosing of those men, the trusting of them with wealth and power at the far ends of the world, was the hardest problem of the age. Umar had solved it by ferocity and vigilance, summoning his governors back at the least suspicion and terrifying them into honesty. The mild Uthman could not, or would not, rule by fear, and he leaned instead upon the men he trusted most, the men of his own blood, and in that choice, however understandable, lay the seed of everything that came after. But the quarrels came, and in the second half of his reign they gathered into a storm that would break the peace of the community forever. Some of the trouble lay in the man himself, for Uthman was gentle where the times perhaps needed sternness, and he was generous to his own family, in a way that his critics found impossible to forgive. He appointed relatives of his powerful Umayyad clan to the governorships of the richest and most important provinces, replacing men who had held office under Umar, and to many this looked like the great old merchant family of Mecca, the very family that had once fought hardest against the Prophet, now quietly gathering the whole empire into its hands. Whether these kinsmen governed well or badly, the appearance of favoritism was poison, and it fed a growing sense among the soldiers and settlers of the garrison cities, especially in Iraq and in Egypt, that the ideals of the early days were being betrayed, that the plain and just rule of Umar had given way to the enrichment of one privileged clan. There were other grievances too, tangled and hard to separate. The wealth of the conquests, which Umar had feared, was working its slow poison exactly as he had foreseen. The great tide of conquest was slowing at the frontiers, and with it slowed the flood of plunder that had bound the soldiers to the state, and given the restless young men of the garrison towns their reward and their purpose. Old jealousies stirred between clans, between the earliest companions and the newer converts, between the men who had done the fighting in the distant provinces and the men who enjoyed the fruits of it in Medina. Discontent spread and fed upon itself, whispered in the camps and the mosques of Kufa and Basra and Fustat, and it found in the person of the mild and pious Uthman, so easy to petition and so slow to punish, a target it might actually reach. Delegations of angry men began to travel to Medina to lay their complaints before the Caliph, and though he heard them and promised redress, the promises were never quite enough, and each disappointment left the anger hotter than before. In the year 656, the anger came at last to Medina in force. Bands of armed and furious men from the garrison cities of Egypt and Iraq converged upon the holy city, not as a formal army, but as a gathering of the aggrieved, demanding that the Caliph change his ways, dismiss his kinsmen, and answer for the wrongs they laid at his door. For a time, it seemed the crisis might be talked down, for Uthman made concessions, and there were men of standing who tried to mediate. But trust had broken down too far, and a rumour, whether true or false, has been argued ever since, that the Caliph had secretly sent orders to have the leaders of the Egyptian party punished. Through the whole affair past the point of return, the rebels laid siege to the Caliph's own house in the heart of Medina, cutting off even his water. The elderly Uthman, a host of golden daffodils, refusing to shed the blood of the community in his own defence and trusting to his innocence and his God, would not let his supporters fight to save him. And so, after a siege of many days, the rebels broke into the house, and the third Caliph, an old man of perhaps 80 years, was cut down in his own home, with the pages of the very Quran he had preserved open before him. It was the first time that the leader of the community had been killed, not by an outside enemy, but by Muslims themselves. And it was a wound from which the early community would never recover. It is worth pausing over the horror of that moment, for the community itself scarcely knew how to comprehend it. In the 50 years since the first revelations, the believers had faced persecution, exile, war, and the loss of their prophet, and they had come through all of it with their unity somehow intact. They had killed the enemies of the faith, and they had lost their own in battle, but they had never, until this day, turned their weapons upon their own leader, the successor of the Prophet, in his own house, in the holy city itself. The killing of Uthman broke something that could not be mended. It was as if a spell had been broken, the spell of the community's belief in its own righteousness and its own unity, and once the thing had been done and seen to be possible, it could be done again. The blood of the third Caliph, spilled by Muslim hands, opened a door that would not close for generations. The tragedy was deepened by how nearly it might have been avoided. For weeks, while the angry men from the provinces gathered around his houses. There had been talk and mediation, and the coming and going of men of goodwill who tried to find a way through. Uthman was old and mild, and, by most accounts, sincerely bewildered by the fury directed at him, willing to hear grievances and to promise reforms, unable quite to grasp that promises were no longer enough. Some of the most respected companions tried to stand between the Caliph and his accusers, and for a time it seemed a settlement might be reached. But trust had rotted through on both sides. The rebels no longer believed the Caliph's promises, and a single spark, the rumour of a secret letter ordering their punishment, whether he wrote it or not, was enough to send the whole thing over the edge into violence. And at the last, when his own supporters begged to be allowed to fight and to save him, Uthman refused, unwilling to be the cause of Muslims shedding the blood of Muslims in his defence, choosing to die rather than to plunge the community into open war. It was, in its way, a noble refusal, and it availed nothing, for the war he sought to prevent by his death came anyway, and worse, and his death was its first cause. News of the killing spread outward through the empire like a stain, and everywhere it went it left anger and grief, and the demand for an answer. In Syria, the murdered caliph's powerful kinsman Muawiyah received the news and understood at once both its horror and its usefulness. For a caliph murdered was a martyr, and a martyr was a banner under which men could be gathered. In Medina and the garrison cities, the companions and the people looked upon what had been done, and knew that the world had changed, that the age of easy unity was over, that the community now carried within itself a wound and a debt of blood that someone would have to reckon with. Into that poisoned and grieving moment, with the body of the third caliph scarcely cold, and the whole community reeling and looking for a leader who might somehow hold it together, the last of the four was about to be called forward to take up an office that had become a crown of thorns. Into this shattered and bleeding moment stepped the fourth and last of the rightly guided Ali ibn Abi Talib. He was the obvious man, in many ways, the man who should perhaps have led long before, cousin of the Prophet and raised in his house, one of the very first to accept the faith while still a boy, husband of the beloved Fatima and father of Hassan and Hussein, the only grandsons of the Prophet. Ali was renowned above almost all others for his courage in battle, his depth of learning, his eloquence, and his uncompromising devotion to justice. To a great many in the community he had long seemed the natural heir, and there were those who believed the leadership should have been his, from the very first, at the death of the Prophet himself. Now, with Uthman dead and the community reeling, the people of Medina turned to Ali and pressed the office upon him. He is said to have been reluctant to take it. In such circumstances, understanding better than anyone the poisoned ground on which he would have to stand, but at last he accepted, and in the year 656 he became caliph. He inherited an impossible situation. The murder of Uthman had torn the community into factions and left a debt of blood that someone would have to answer for, and Ali, who had taken power in the wake of the killing and, with the support of some who had taken part in it, found himself unable to satisfy the demand for vengeance without tearing his fragile authority apart. To punish the killers he needed unity and strength, and he possessed neither, for the killers were tangled up among his own supporters in the garrison cities, and to move against them was to risk losing the only base he had. His enemies seized upon exactly this. They raised the cry that the blood of the murdered caliph must be avenged, and they demanded that Ali either deliver up the guilty or be counted as sharing in their guilt. It was a demand he could not meet, and it became the banner under which the community would march into a civil war against itself, the first great civil war of its history, which later generations would call the fitna, a word that means a time of trial, of temptation, of tearing apart. The first blow fell not from the direction Ali most feared, but from an unexpected coalition. Two of the most senior companions, men who had themselves sat on the council that chose Uthman, joined with Aisha, the widow of the Prophet, a woman of great intelligence and force of character, who had her own grievances and her own conviction that the murder must be avenged. Together they raised a force and marched on the city of Basra in Iraq, seizing it and calling the community to rise against Ali in the name of justice for the murdered caliph. Ali marched to meet them, and the two armies came together near Basra in the year 656 in a battle remembered as the Battle of the Camel, so called because the fiercest fighting swirled around. The camel, upon which Aisha sat in a curtained litter, watching the struggle from its back and serving as a rallying point for her side. It was a bitter and dreadful thing. Companions of the Prophet killing one another on the field, and the losses were heavy before Ali's forces at last prevailed. The two senior companions who had led the revolt were both killed. Aisha herself was treated with great respect and courtesy by the victorious Ali, who saw her safely escorted back to Medina to live out her days in honoured retirement, far from the wars her cause had helped to begin. But the Battle of the Camel settled nothing, for behind it loomed a far more dangerous adversary, a man who would prove to be the ablest and most patient politician of the entire age. His name was Muawiyah, and he was the governor of Syria, a kinsman of the murdered Uthman from the powerful Umayyad clan who had ruled that rich province for many years, and had built there a loyal and disciplined army and a firm and orderly administration. Muawiyah raised the cause of vengeance for Uthman with a cold and calculating persistence, and he had a weapon of terrible force at his disposal. He displayed the blood-stained shirt of the murdered caliph, and the severed fingers of Uthman's wife, who had tried to shield her husband in the great mosque of Damascus, so that all who saw them were moved to fury and to the demand for revenge. He did not at first claim the caliphate for himself. He claimed only that Ali had failed to punish the murderers and had thereby forfeited his right to obedience, and on that ground he refused to acknowledge Ali as caliph at all. The stage was set for the greatest confrontation of the war. The two armies, that of the Caliph Ali, drawn largely from Iraq, and that of Muawiyah, drawn from Syria, met in the year 657 on a great plain by the Euphrates at a place called Siffin, and there they faced one another for a long and agonizing time. Neither side, at first, truly wished to plunge into the horror of a full battle between fellow Muslims, and there were weeks of skirmishing and negotiation and hesitation before the real fighting began. When it came at last, it was terrible. Days of hard and bloody struggle in which thousands fell, and slowly the advantage began to tilt toward Ali. It seemed that he might win, that the war might be decided, and at that very moment, Muawiyah's shrewd advisor devised a stroke of desperate cunning that would rob Ali of his victory and change the course of everything. He ordered the Syrian soldiers to raise copies of the Quran upon the points of their spears, and to call out that the dispute should be settled not by the sword, but by the judgment of the Book of God, the sacred text itself. It was a maneuver of pure calculation, made at the moment of looming defeat, but it struck at something deep in the hearts of Ali's own men, many of whom were pious to the point of scruple, and could not bear to keep killing their brothers when the Holy Book was held up before them. and the enemy called for God to decide, a host his own daffodils meant, against his own better judgment, and under pressure from a large part of his army that refused to fight on. Ali was forced to halt the battle and agree to submit the quarrel to arbitration, to a judgment by chosen men who would decide the matter according to the Quran. It was a grievous mistake, and Ali seems to have known it, even as he was compelled to make it, for by agreeing to arbitrate, he tacitly accepted that Muawiyah's claim was a matter worth arbitrating, that the question of the caliphate was genuinely open when he had held it by right and had nearly won it in the field. The arbitration that followed was drawn out and murky, and its outcome, however it truly went, did nothing to help Ali and everything to help Muawiyah, who emerged from it with his standing raised and his rivals diminished. Ali had come to Siffin, the caliph, victorious and nearly triumphant, and he left it weakened, his authority shaken, his cause slipping away, having gained nothing and lost much. And out of the bitter aftermath of that halted battle, there arose a new and deadly force that would haunt him to his death. For a large body of Ali's own supporters, those same fierce and pious men who had forced him to accept the arbitration, now turned against him for having accepted it. Their reasoning was as rigid as it was fateful. They declared that judgment belonged to God alone, that to submit the question of the caliphate to the arbitration of men was itself a sin, and that Ali, by agreeing to it, had abandoned the truth and forfeited his right to lead. These men, who broke away and went out from his camp, became known as the Kharijites, a word meaning those who go out or secede, and they were the first great schism of the community. Uncompromising, absolute, and willing to kill any who did not share their harsh certainty, Ali was forced to turn his weary army against them, and he crushed them in a battle. But he could not destroy them entirely, for their creed was a thing of the spirit that survived the ruin of their bodies, and they nursed a burning hatred for him above all others, holding him responsible for the whole catastrophe. His enemies now surrounded him on every side, Muawiyah secure and growing stronger in Syria and Egypt, the Kharijites plotting in the shadows, and his own base in Iraq worn down by war and weariness and disappointment. The great and pious Ali, the last of the rightly guided, was hemmed in by the wreckage of a community he had given his life to serve. The end, when it came from the Kharijites, and from their absolute and pitiless conviction. According to the tradition, a group of them met and resolved that the whole tragedy of the community sprang from 3 men, Ali and Muawiyah and the governor of Egypt, and that the world would be set right only if all 3 were killed on the same day. Assassins were chosen and sent out, each to his target. The plots against Muawiyah and the governor of Egypt failed or fell short, their intended victims escaping with their lives. But the assassin sent against Ali did not fail. In the year 661, in the great mosque of Kufa, as Ali came to lead the morning prayer, the killer struck him with a poisoned blade. Like Umar before him, the caliph was cut down in the very act of prayer in the heart of his own city, and after lingering for a day or 2 from the poison in the wound, he died. So passed Ali ibn Abi Talib, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet, the last of the 4 rightly guided caliphs. A man remembered across the whole of the Muslim world, though in different ways by different communities, as a paragon of courage, justice, and faith. With his death, the age of the Rashidun came to its close 30 years, almost to the season after the death of the Prophet had opened it. What followed his death confirmed how completely the world had changed. Ali's supporters in Iraq turned to his elder son Hassan, the grandson of the Prophet, and pledged their loyalty to him as caliph. But Hassan was a man of peace, and he looked upon the ruin that years of civil war had made of the community. The fields untended, the young men dead, the brotherhood torn to shreds, and he judged that further bloodshed would only deepen the wound. Muawiyah, secure and powerful, marched toward Iraq, and rather than plunge the community into yet another terrible battle, Hassan came to terms with him. In an agreement remembered as a great act of reconciliation, Hassan gave up his claim and acknowledged Muawiyah as caliph in return for guarantees for himself and his family and his followers. The year of this settlement was called by later generations the Year of Unity, or the Year of the Community, for with it the long and bloody civil war at last came to an end, and the whole empire was gathered once more under a single ruler. But the ruler was Muawiyah of the Umayyad clan, governing from Damascus in Syria, and the character of the leadership he founded was something new. For Muawiyah, before his own death, arranged for his son to succeed him, and with that single act the caliphate became, in effect, a hereditary monarchy, passing down within one family from father to son as a throne is inherited. This was a decisive break with everything the age of the Rashidun had represented. The first 4 caliphs had each come to power through some form of consent or choice by the leading men of the community. Whether the acclamation of Abu Bakr, the nomination of Umar, the council that chose Uthman, or the pledging of loyalty to Ali. None of them had founded a dynasty. None had passed the office to a son. They had lived, for the most part, with a striking simplicity, walking among their people, patching their own clothes, sleeping on the bare ground, holding themselves accountable and answerable, at least in the ideal that later ages cherished, to the community and to God. With the Umayyads there came instead a court, a dynasty, a capital of splendour, a rule that looked in many ways like the very empires the conquest had overthrown. The heroic and turbulent age of the 4 companions was over, and the age of kings had begun. It is precisely this contrast that gave the Rashidun their name and their enduring place in memory, for looking back across the centuries at the dynasties that followed, later generations saw in those first 30 years a lost golden age, an age when the leaders were still the plain companions of the Prophet, and the ideal and the reality still, however imperfectly, stood close together. Yet the wounds of the fitna did not heal with the Year of Unity, for they had cut too deep, and out of them grew a division that runs through the Muslim world to this day. The great question of who had the right to lead the community after the Prophet, which had first stirred in the covered hall at Medina, and had torn the community apart in the wars of Ali, hardened over time into 2 enduring understandings of the faith and its history. There were those who came to hold that the leadership had rightly belonged, from the very beginning, to Ali and to the family of the Prophet through him and his sons, and that the earlier caliphs, whatever their virtues, had held an office that was not truly theirs. This conviction, deepened by grief and by the later sufferings of the Prophet's descendants, grew into the tradition known as the Shia, the party of Ali, and there were those who honoured all 4 of the rightly guided equally as the legitimate success, chosen by the community, and who traced their understanding of the faith through the broad consensus and practice of that early community. This became the tradition known as the Sunni. The seeds of that great and lasting division were sown in the very events of this story. In the disputed succession, in the murder of Uthman, in the tragedy of Ali, so that the age of the Rashidun is remembered not only as a golden age of unity, but also, and at the same time, as the age in which the deepest division of all was born. And so we come to the strange and moving paradox at the heart of the whole story. In the space of a single generation, roughly 30 years, a community that had begun as a persecuted handful in the Valley of Mecca had conquered two of the mightiest empires in the world and built a state that stretched across 3 continents, from the highlands of Persia to the deserts of Libya, a feat of expansion so rapid and so vast that it has few equals in all of recorded history. The Persian Empire, ancient and immovable, was gone entirely, swept away. The Roman Empire had lost its richest provinces, Syria and Egypt, and more, and would never regain them. Whole civilizations passed under a new order, a new faith, and in time a new language, changes so profound that the map and the character of a great part of the world were remarred, and have never been unmade since. It is nearly impossible to overstate the scale of what those 30 years accomplished, or the depth of the mark they left upon the world we still live in. And yet, at the same time, that very generation ended in tears. Of the 4 rightly guided caliphs, 3 were murdered, 2 of them struck down in the act of prayer, and the last years of the age were consumed by a civil war in which the closest companions of the Prophet killed one another upon the field. The community that had conquered the world nearly destroyed itself, and it emerged from the ordeal permanently divided in ways that endure to the present day. The old austere Umar, weeping over the treasures of Persia laid before him, and foreseeing the envy and the strife that such riches would bring, had understood something true. The very success of the conquest, the flood of wealth and power it released, had corroded the simple brotherhood that had made the conquest possible. It is a pattern the world has seen many times, in many ages, and among many peoples, the hard and unified poor who rise to greatness, and then are undone by the wealth that greatness brings. But rarely has it played out on so vast a stage, or with so much at stake as in the story of these 4 men and the empire they brought into being. Let us linger for a while before the story settles into its close, upon the world that these conquests made. For the change was quieter and slower than the battles suggest, and understanding it is part of understanding the whole. When the armies of the desert took a province, the life of the ordinary people who lived there did not, at first, transform overnight. The farmer in the Nile Valley still rose before dawn to tend his fields and his beasts. The potter in a Syrian town still turned his wheel. The merchant of a Persian city still weighed his goods and haggled over his prices. The great mass of the conquered peoples remained, for a long time, of their old faiths, Christian and Jewish and Zoroastrian, worshipping as their fathers had worshipped. And the new rulers, for the most part and especially in these early years, did not press them hard to change. What changed first was who governed and who collected the taxes, and beneath that, slowly and over generations, the deeper things began to shift. The language people spoke in the markets, the faith their grandchildren would hold, the whole texture of a civilization. The garrison cities that Umar had planted became the great engines of this change. Kufa and Basra in Iraq, Fustat in Egypt, and the others grew from armed camps into teeming cities, drawing in people of every origin, Arabs and Persians and the conquered peoples, soldiers and merchants and scholars and craftsmen, all mingling in the crowded lanes and marketplaces. In these cities the new civilization took shape, a host of golden daffodils, not as a simple transplanting of the desert into the settled lands, but as a rich blending of the conquerors and the conquered, the vigour and the faith of Arabia, meeting the ancient learning and craft, and administration of Persia and of the Roman East. The Arabs learned from the peoples they had conquered even as they ruled them. They took over the tax rolls and the administrative methods of the old empires, kept on the trained officials who knew how to run a province, adopted the coinage and much of the machinery of government, and bent all of it to the service of the new order. In time, the language of the conquerors spread through the marketplaces and the offices and the mosques, until Arabic became the common tongue of a great swath of the world, from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the borders of Persia, a linguistic transformation as vast and enduring as the political one. There is a temptation, looking back across the centuries at so much war and conquest, to imagine the whole thing as an unbroken storm of violence. But the reality was more complex and in its way more interesting. The terms offered to surrendering cities were often generous, guaranteeing life and property, and the freedom to worship in return for submission and a tax. And many places chose to come to terms rather than to fight to the death, precisely because the terms were bearable for a great many of the ordinary people of Syria and Egypt, worn down by the crushing taxes and the endless wars and the bitter religious persecutions of the Roman Empire, which had hounded and punished those Christians who held to the wrong understanding of their own faith. The coming of the new rulers brought a lighter hand than the one they had known. The conquerors demanded their tax and their submission, but they did not much concern themselves with the fine points of Christian doctrine over which the old empire had shed so much blood, and to a persecuted congregation this indifference could feel very much like tolerance. It would be wrong to paint the conquest as gentle, for war is never gentle, and there was cruelty and destruction enough. But it would be equally wrong to imagine that it was everywhere resisted to the last. For in many places it was not, and the speed of the whole vast enterprise owed as much to the exhaustion and the divisions of the old order as to the strength of the new. And through it all, holding the enormous structure together in these first crucial decades, ran the ideal that gave the age its name. The ideal of the rightly guided rule of leaders who held power as a trust rather than a possession, who lived plainly, who feared to answer before God for the least of their subjects, who could be approached and petitioned and even rebuked by an ordinary member of the community. How perfectly that ideal was ever kept is a fair question, and the strife of the later years shows how quickly it began to fray. But the ideal itself was real, and it left a lasting standard against which all later rulers of the Muslim world would be measured, usually to their disadvantage. The image of Umar entering Jerusalem on foot, in his patched cloak, leading the camel while his servant rode, became a kind of mirror held up to every king and caliph who came after, a reminder of what leadership had once been, or had at least been believed to be in the golden morning of the community. It is that image, as much as the map of conquest, that explains why the age of the four caliphs has kept its hold on the imagination for 1400 years. Let us then, as the story draws toward its rest, look one last time upon the four men themselves, for in the end, it is they who give the age its shape and its meaning. First there was Abu Bakr, the gentle merchant, the oldest and dearest friend, so soft in manner that few would have marked him as a leader, who yet held the community together in the terrible hour of the Prophet's death, and refused, with an iron that no one had expected, to surrender the smallest part of what had been built. His caliphate was the shortest, barely 2 years, and yet without it there might have been nothing at all, for it was he who steadied the frightened community, crushed the great rebellion, and set the conquests in motion. He died as he had lived, simply and without grasping, having asked that the little he owned be returned to the treasury, so that he might meet his God, owing the community nothing. Then there was Umar, the towering and terrible figure, stern as the desert, whose grief had nearly broken the community, and whose strength then held it up for 10 of the most decisive years in the history of the world. Under his hand, the empire was won, and, harder still, was organized and governed, its provinces set in order, its armies fed, its calendar fixed, its ideal of just and accountable rule stamped so deeply upon the age that it never wholly faded. He wore patched clothes, while the treasures of kings flowed toward his city. He walked the streets at night to see that none went hungry, and he feared God with a fear that made him a terror to the corrupt and a shield to the weak. He died as Ali would die, struck down at prayer, and the community that mourned him knew that it would not see his like again. Then there was Uthman, the mild and generous old man, honoured for his early faith and his gentle nature, who gave the community its single fixed and enduring text of the Quran, and expanded its empire across the seas, but whose very mildness, and whose kindness to his own kin, opened the door through which disaster entered. He was killed in his own home by men of his own community, an old man of 80 with the holy book open before him. And his death broke a seal that could never be closed again, loosing upon the community the long civil war that would consume its unity. And last there was Ali, the cousin raised as a son, the warrior of legend, the fountain of wisdom and eloquence and piety, who came to power in the worst of all possible hours and spent his caliphate struggling against a tide he could not turn, hemmed in by enemies on every side, and who fell at last to a fanatic's blade in the mosque of Kufa, the fourth and final light of a fading age. 4 men, 4 companions of one prophet, 4 very different lives, bound together forever in memory, as the rightly guided. The men who built the empire and paid for it, most of them with their lives. The shadow of these years reached forward far beyond the death of Ali, and to feel the full weight of the age we must let our gaze drift a little way past its end, to the sorrow that its divisions would soon bring. Ali had 2 sons by Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet, and they were the only grandsons of the Prophet to live to manhood, Hassan and Hussein, cherished above all others by those who loved the family of the house. Hassan, the elder, made his peace with Muawiyah and withdrew from the struggle for power, living quietly and dying not many years later. But his younger brother, Hussein, would not in the end submit to the new order of hereditary kings. Years after the close of this story, when Muawiyah had died and passed his throne to his son, Hussein rose against that succession in the name of the older ideal, the ideal of a community that chose its leaders, and did not simply inherit them. He set out with a small band of family and followers, and on a burning plain in Iraq, called Karbala, he and nearly all who were with him were surrounded and killed, cut off from water under the desert sun, the grandson of the Prophet slain by the soldiers of a caliph. That tragedy, falling just beyond the edge of our tale, gave the grief of the divided community its deepest and most lasting form, and it is mourned to this day by millions, an open wound that the golden age of the Rashidun had, without meaning to, made ready. And yet, for all the sorrow, we should not let the story close on grief alone, for what these 4 men and their generation built did not die with them. The dynasties that followed, the Umayyads from their court at Damascus, and after them, the Abbasids from their glittering new capital at Baghdad, inherited an empire and a civilization whose foundations had been laid in those first 30 turbulent years. The administrative order that Umar had sketched, the garrison cities that became centres of learning, the fixed text of the Quran that Uthman had preserved, the vast conquered lands that Abu Bakr had dared to reach for, and that all 4 had held, all of these passed on and grew, and flowered into one of the great civilizations of the world, a civilization of science and philosophy and poetry and art that would, in the centuries to come, preserve and extend the learning of the ancient world and light lamps of knowledge, while much of the rest of the world lay in shadow. The seed of all of that was planted in the age of the rightly guided, in the courage and the labour and the sacrifice of that first generation. So the age of the Rashidun stands in memory, as a thing of two faces, forever turned toward each other. It is the golden dawn, the age when the leaders still walked among their people in patched cloaks, and the ideal of just and humble rule stood bright and close. The age of the astonishing conquest that remade the world in a single generation. And it is at the same time the age of the first great sorrow, the age of murdered caliphs and civil war, and the birth of the divisions that would never fully heal. Both are true, and they are true together for the same wealth and power that measured the greatness of the conquest. Also corroded the brotherhood that had made it, exactly as the weeping Umar had foreseen when the treasures of Persia were poured out before him. It is one of the oldest and saddest patterns in the story of humankind, and here it played out upon a stage as wide as 3 continents, with consequences that shape the world still. The 4 companions rose out of the desert, conquered the empires of the ancient world, built the beginnings of a new civilization, and passed, most of them, through the gate of a violent death, leaving behind them an empire, a division, and a memory that has never faded in 1400 years. It is worth pausing, too, upon the men who actually did the conquering, the ordinary soldiers whose names are mostly lost, for it was upon their shoulders that the whole vast enterprise was carried. They were, in the main, men of the tribes of Arabia, hard and lean and used to hardship, raised in a world where a day without water could kill, and where a man learned young to endure heat and hunger and long marches without complaint. When they rode north into Syria and east into Iraq, they carried little, a spear and a sword and a shield, a few provisions, a camel or a horse, and above all, a fierce conviction that gave their endurance a purpose. They fought not as hired soldiers fighting for a wage, as so many of the men in the imperial armies did, but as members of a community bound by faith and by blood, each man knowing the men beside him, each answerable to his clan and his companions for his courage or his cowardice. This was a great part of their strength, for an army of such men, believing that victory was a blessing and that death in the struggle was itself a kind of triumph, was very hard to break. Their lives, once the great battles were won, settled into the strange, half-military, half-civilian existence of the garrison cities. A soldier's name was written in the Diwan, the great register of the community, and against it was set the share of the state revenues that he and his family were owed, so that even in peace he remained a soldier of the community, called out when he was needed and provided for in between. In the sprawling new cities of Kufa and Basra and Fustat, these men built houses and raised families and mingled with the peoples of the conquered lands, and their children grew up in a world their fathers could never have imagined, a world of settled streets and markets and running water, far from the tents and the wells of the desert. Something was gained in that transformation, and something was lost. The wealth and the ease of the settled life softened the hard edges of the old desert virtues, and the crowded, restless, ambitious cities became, within a single generation, the very places where discontent gathered and where the civil wars found their armies. The men who had conquered the world settled down to enjoy it, and in the enjoying of it they began, slowly, to quarrel over it. There is something deeply human in all of this, and something that speaks across the great gulf of years to our own time. These were not distant legends, but people with all the courage and greed and faith and folly that people have always had, caught up in events larger than any of them could fully understand or control. They dared enormous things and achieved them. They fell short of their own ideals and grieved over the falling short. They loved and hated and forgave and failed to forgive, and out of the whole tangle of their striving, there came a new chapter in the long story of the world. When we look back upon them now, across 14 centuries, it is right to feel wonder at what they accomplished, and right to feel sorrow at how their unity was lost, and right, perhaps most of all, to feel a certain tenderness toward them, as we might toward any people who reached for greatness and paid for it dearly. And so, from a small town of mud, brick and palm groves on the edge of the Arabian desert, where a man lay dying, in the arms of his wife, and a frightened community asked who would lead them now, there grew in the space of a single lifetime an empire that stretched from the mountains of Persia to the sands of Libya, and a memory that would outlast every stone of it. The armies have long since turned to dust. The garrison cities have risen and fallen and risen again. The names of the 4 caliphs are spoken still, in reverence and in sorrow, wherever their story is remembered. And the desert that gave them birth lies quiet under the same wide-skied sky, keeping its silence over the beginning of it all. And here our story settles into stillness. The armies fade into the dust of the plains where they once marched, the great cities dim and grow quiet, and the 4 companions pass into the long memory of the world. The years drift away like sand carried on a warm night wind, and the sorrows and the glories alike grow soft and distant, until nothing remains but the calm dark and the slow turning of the stars above a sleeping desert. There is nothing more you need to hold on to now. Let the names grow quiet. Let the long road of this story come to its rest, as all roads do. Rest now and let it go. Sleep well and good night.